It was supposed to be a quick hike, just a few hours in the woods to clear my head. I needed a break. Life had been stressful, work was a grind, and everything felt a bit too overwhelming lately. The forest trail was one I'd done before, something familiar and easy. It was a path that looped back on itself, so there was no real chance of getting lost. At least that's what I told myself when I set out. I started early in the morning, the kind of crisp air that tells you the sun hasn't fully taken over the day yet. The sky was that pale blue that only happens at dawn, the kind you only notice if you're awake early enough to catch it. The trees around me were tall, their branches just beginning to wake up with the first light of day. The air smelled earthy, like damp soil and pine, and I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Felt peaceful. I had my usual gear, a small backpack with water, a couple of snacks, a map, and my phone, though I wasn't planning on needing it. The trail was well marked, with signs every few hundred yards. I'd hiked it a handful of times, and each time, it felt like a quiet escape from everything. It was just me, nature, and the peace that comes from being away from the world. The first few miles went by quickly, the path winding through thick trees and along small, quiet streams. The sounds of the forest were almost rhythmic, the chirp of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional splash of a fish darting in the water. I could feel the tension from the past few weeks start to melt away. The longer I walked, the more the weight of everything seemed to lighten. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, just a small shift in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, more still. The chirping birds seemed to quiet down, and the rustling of leaves stopped. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a tension in the air, like something was watching me, waiting. I glanced at my watch. It had been about an hour since I started. I looked ahead. There was a bend in the path I hadn't noticed before, and the trees around me seemed denser, more tightly packed. The trail narrowed a bit too. I didn't remember this part of the woods being so overgrown, but maybe I had just forgotten. It was easy to lose track of things out here, especially when the landscape all started to look the same. I shrugged it off. It was probably nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling that had crept up on me. It was just the woods, nothing more. But then, as I rounded the bend, I saw it. A fork in the path. That wasn't right. I was sure the trail didn't split like this. I stood there for a moment, staring at the two diverging paths ahead. One path seemed to lead up a small hill, while the other descended into a thick cluster of trees. Both paths were worn, as if they'd been used often, but I couldn't remember either of them from the last time I hiked here. I pulled out my map, trying to calm my nerves. I had only ever walked the main loop. The map should have been straightforward, showing a simple circular trail. But as I scanned the paper, my heart began to race. I couldn't find the fork. There was no sign of these two paths splitting off. I traced my finger along the route, but there was no place where it diverged like this. I tried not to panic. Maybe I had missed something. It was possible I had taken a wrong turn earlier and didn't realize it. But that didn't explain why I didn't remember this fork, or why the path looked so unfamiliar. Maybe it was an old trail that had been abandoned or something that was added recently. It didn't really matter. I'd figure it out. I decided to take the path to the right, the one that descended into the trees. It looked more familiar, even though my mind was still spinning with questions. I'd find my way back. I always did. The further I went down that path, the more it felt like something was wrong. The air seemed thicker, and the light from the sun was blocked by the dense canopy above. It wasn't dark, but it was a strange, unnatural dimness that seemed to swallow the space around me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every step seemed heavier than the last. I walked for what felt like hours, but when I checked my phone, only 30 minutes had passed. The trail, which had once been clear and easy to follow, now seemed to twist in strange ways, as if the forest itself was shifting. My heart began to beat faster, and my breath became shallow. It wasn't just the path that had changed, it was everything. The trees seemed closer now, pressing in from all sides, their branches intertwining above to form a thick, tangled roof that blocked out most of the sky. I stopped, trying to gather myself. My phone showed no signal as expected, but there was no reason for this sense of disorientation. I should have recognized this part of the woods. I should have been able to find my way back. But there was no sign of the fork I had passed earlier. The trail seemed to have vanished completely, swallowed up by the forest. I forced myself to move forward, hoping that with each step, I'd find something familiar. But the more I walked, the more I realized just how lost I was. The trees were no longer the towering pines I remembered. They had changed into something darker, more twisted. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, and I had to be careful not to slip as I trudged on. I looked at the sky through the gaps in the canopy. The sun was still up, but the light had begun to dim. It wasn't quite evening yet, but there was a strange, muted quality to the light, as if it was being filtered through something thick. I took a deep breath, trying to focus. Panic wouldn't help me now. I needed to stay calm, think clearly. I could backtrack. I could retrace my steps. But the problem was, I had no idea where I'd come from. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, when I noticed something odd on the ground ahead of me. A small, faded sign, half hidden in the underbrush. I bent down to look at it, brushing away the leaves that had gathered around it. It was barely legible, just a few words scratched into the wood. Trail closed. The words were old, worn, and faded, but they were clear enough. I hadn't seen anything about trail closures when I started. Had something changed? Had they closed off parts of the woods for some reason? I stood up and surveyed the area around me. There was no sign of anything familiar, no landmarks, no clear path. The woods seemed endless, stretching out in all directions. And then it hit me. I wasn't just lost. I was trapped. The woods weren't just unfamiliar now. They were confusing me on purpose. The path had shifted. The trees had shifted. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe deeply. I had to stay calm. I knew the basics: stay where you are, don't wander too far. But I had already been walking for hours, and everything felt different now. The forest was closing in on me. The sky was dimming, the air heavy with that same oppressive stillness. I decided to stop and try to make sense of my situation. I couldn't waste any more energy. I'd stay put for a bit, eat some of the snacks I had with me, and think. The moment I sat down, I realized how quiet it had become. The only sound was my breathing. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, but I couldn't figure out why. This was just a forest, after all. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow. Quick, fleeting. Just a glimpse, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I stood up, scanning the area, but saw nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took another step, then another, until I was walking again, but at a quicker pace. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was someone out there? Was it an animal? But there were no footprints, no signs of anything unusual. The feeling of being watched lingered, but it wasn't tangible. It was a feeling, a presence in the air. The woods grew darker as I pressed on, but I didn't stop. I couldn't afford to. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I came across something familiar. The fork in the trail, the one I had passed earlier. I had come full circle somehow, despite everything. The path I had chosen had eventually led me back. My heart pounded as I made my way to the right path, the one that would take me back to the parking lot. And when I finally saw the clearing ahead, the open space where the trailhead began, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I was out. I was safe. And for the first time in hours, I let myself breathe easy. I was back in the real world. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a peaceful walk through the woods to clear my head. But now, standing in the middle of the dense forest with no idea which direction I was supposed to go, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The sun, which had been so bright and welcoming when I first set out, had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the path I had been following. The trees, now towering over me, seemed darker, their branches clawing at the sky as if trying to keep me from escaping. I had come out here alone to get away from everything: the stress of work, the noise of the city, the constant buzz of social media. Just me, my backpack, and the simple task of finding a good spot to sit and breathe in the quiet. But now, every step felt like it took me further away from where I had started. At first, the trail had been easy to follow. There were markers on the trees, small but noticeable signs showing which way to go. But somewhere along the line, I must have missed a turn. I'd stepped off the main path for a moment to take a photo of something. A cluster of mushrooms I hadn't seen before, or maybe the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. Now, I couldn't find the path again. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "It's just a little lost," I told myself, repeating the phrase like a mantra. "I'll just backtrack, and I'll be fine." So, I retraced my steps, or at least I thought I was. But every direction I turned seemed the same. The trees stood like sentinels, their trunks thick and unyielding, blocking out any glimpse of the world outside. The only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of an unseen bird. I didn't hear any footsteps, didn't hear anyone else nearby. For all I knew, I was the only person for miles. I pulled out my phone, hoping the GPS would give me some sense of direction. But the screen showed no signal, just the little spinning circle that meant I was utterly alone in this forest. The faint light from the dying sun made the trees look even more sinister, their shadows stretching out as if they were closing in around me. I stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. The eerie quiet weighed on me. It felt like the world had become a giant, dark cavern. The longer I stood there, the more I felt something pressing in on me, some invisible weight pulling at my chest. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. I was lost, really lost, and panic started to claw at my mind. Shaking my head, I forced myself to move again, trying not to let the fear take over. "Calm down," I whispered to myself, rubbing my temples. I needed to think. I needed to focus. This was just a bad situation, but I could handle it. I had to. I took out my water bottle, taking a long gulp. The cold water helped, but only for a moment. I looked around again, scanning the landscape. There was no obvious trail, no sign of where I had come from. Everything looked the same: more trees, more underbrush, more endless stretches of forest. I couldn't help but wonder how I had managed to get so turned around. It was just a few hours ago that I had been so sure of where I was. Now, the woods seemed to stretch out forever, closing in like a maze that had no way out. I decided to keep walking. It seemed like the only option. So, I picked a direction and began moving forward, my feet crunching on the dry leaves and twigs beneath me. The sun was almost gone now, and a cold breeze began to pick up. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, wishing I had brought something warmer. I knew that if I didn't find my way out soon, I'd be in trouble. As I moved deeper into the woods, the air grew thicker with each step. The scent of earth and pine mixed with something else, something unfamiliar. I couldn't quite place it, but it was sharp, like something rotting just out of sight. The deeper I went, the worse it got. I tried not to think about it, but it was hard to ignore. My feet began to ache from walking for so long, and my stomach growled. reminding me that I hadn't eaten since this morning. I was starting to feel tired, and the longer I went without finding any sign of the path, the more desperate I became. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel the panic building again, clawing at the edges of my mind. And then, just as I was about to give in to the panic, I saw it. A flicker of light through the trees. A faint glow, almost like a lantern. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe someone else was out here. Maybe they could help me find my way back. I hurried towards the light, hoping beyond hope that it wasn't just another trick of my mind. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from a small clearing ahead. The trees were thinner here, and the ground was softer, almost marshy. When I reached the clearing, I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the center of the clearing, was a small campfire. The orange glow danced in the dark, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. I could see a few logs arranged around the fire, and beside it, there was a small tent. For a moment, I thought I had found a group of hikers, or maybe a ranger's camp. Relief flooded over me, but as I stepped closer, something about the scene made me freeze. There was no sound, no voices, no movement. The fire crackled, but there was no one sitting by it. The tent was empty, and there were no signs of life. Felt wrong. I took another step forward, the crackling of the fire the only sound I could hear. I could feel my pulse quicken again as I realized something wasn't right. The air was too still, too quiet. I looked around the clearing, scanning the trees for any signs of movement, but there was nothing. The fire burned brightly, but the emptiness around it was suffocating. I turned to leave, my mind racing with questions. Was this someone else's campsite? Why was it abandoned? Did something happen here? As I started to back away, I heard a sound behind me. It was a soft rustle, like the wind brushing through the leaves. I turned, but there was no one there. I felt my throat tighten, my senses on high alert. I wasn't alone, but where was everyone? And why was I hearing things? I stepped back again, this time with purpose. I wasn't sticking around to figure this out. But as I turned to go, I heard another rustle. Closer this time, just behind me. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. Every part of me screamed to run, but my legs felt frozen, my feet glued to the spot. Then, just as I was about to turn and flee, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. And this time, it wasn't just the wind. This was real. Someone was following me. I didn't wait to see who it was. Without thinking, I sprinted back into the forest, heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. The footsteps followed me, quick and steady, just out of sight. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was following me. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a quick trip, just a few hours out in the woods to get some fresh air and enjoy the peace of nature. I had planned it all out. The weather was perfect that morning, crisp and cool, the kind of day that made you want to be outside. I had never been up this trail before, but the map seemed clear enough. Just a loop through some dense forest, then back down to the parking lot where I left my car. Easy. But as I took the first few steps, things started to feel different than I had expected. First, it was just the quiet. I was used to the sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the chatter of people, the constant background noise. But out here in the forest, there was none of that. It was almost unnerving how still everything was. The leaves on the trees barely rustled, and the birds, though I could hear them faintly in the distance, seemed to be very far away. I kept walking, pushing through the underbrush, and told myself to relax. The trail was clearly marked, and the sun was shining down through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. For the first hour, I was enjoying myself. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. My phone had no signal, but that didn't bother me. I didn't come out here to be connected. I came for solitude. But then, as I moved deeper into the woods, something started to change. The trail began to narrow, the trees grew thicker, and the sunlight started to fade, even though it was still early in the afternoon. I wasn't worried at first. Trails do that sometimes, right? They narrow, they twist, they curve. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled further and further off course. By the time I looked around again, everything seemed different. The trees weren't the same as they had been before. The leaves on the ground looked older, more withered, as though they'd been there for much longer than I had been hiking. I stopped to check the map, but the screen on my phone was blurry, the battery already halfway drained from the hike. I had only been walking for about 2 hours, but something felt wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe I was just imagining things. But as I kept walking, it felt like I wasn't making any progress. The forest just kept going, each step leading to more of the same dense underbrush, more twisted branches, more uneven ground. The trail seemed to vanish, and I couldn't remember the last time I saw a marker. Panic began to creep in slowly, quietly, until it was all I could think about. It wasn't long before the sky started to change. The sun, which had been bright when I first started out, was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself to keep calm, to think logically. I knew the woods could be disorienting, but I should be able to find my way back. Just retrace your steps, I thought. But when I turned around, the trail wasn't where it should have been. It wasn't a sudden realization. It was a growing discomfort, a gnawing feeling in my stomach. The world around me had started to shift, ever so subtly, until I realized I couldn't remember which way I had come from. I walked in circles, looking for something, anything, that might tell me where the trail had gone, but all I saw was the same thing over and over. Trees, rocks, the same twisted roots and thick underbrush. No signs, no markers. I tried to stay calm. I couldn't afford to panic. My phone was still in my pocket, but without a signal, there wasn't much I could do with it. I thought about calling someone, but the battery was low. I kept walking, but the more I walked, the more lost I felt. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the little light that had been left. I could barely see ahead of me now, and the ground was uneven, making every step feel uncertain. Hours passed. I was starting to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I tried to remember the map, but it was all a blur now. The trail was gone. The forest seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. The more I tried to find my way, the deeper I sank into this feeling of being trapped. I wasn't just lost. I was disoriented, disconnected from everything that had once felt familiar. My stomach growled, and I realized I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I still had some granola bars in my backpack, but the idea of food didn't really appeal to me. I wanted to get out. I wanted to go back to the car, to the safety of the parking lot. But no matter which direction I chose, the forest only seemed to get darker, denser. The sounds of the forest started to change too. It wasn't the gentle breeze or the occasional rustle of leaves that I was used to. Now, it was almost as if the forest was alive in a different way. There were noises that didn't fit. Branches snapping in the distance, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, and once, something that sounded like a low growl. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. Nothing to worry about. I kept walking. The sun had almost completely set now, and the darkness in the forest felt like it was swallowing me whole. My headlamp barely pierced the blackness around me, and I was beginning to realize just how far from safety I really was. I thought I heard something again, a faint whispering, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I took a deep breath and moved on. The only sound now was my own footsteps crunching against the leaves beneath my feet. I was beginning to accept the fact that I might not make it out tonight. The reality of being lost was sinking in, and I could feel my heart rate climbing as panic threatened to take over. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that I could figure it out, but the longer I stayed out here, the more my hopes seemed to fade. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a clearing that I felt a flicker of hope. The area was open, surrounded by trees, but I could see the sky again. The faint light from the moon illuminated the grass in front of me, and for a brief moment, I thought I might be near a road or some sort of path. I stood there, scanning the horizon, but all I saw were more trees. And then I realized there was a faint light in the distance, coming from beyond the tree-line. My heart leapt in my chest. A light, maybe a cabin, maybe another hiker, maybe even a road. I moved toward it, heart pounding, each step more desperate than the last. The closer I got, the more certain I became that it was a light from a person. But as I drew nearer, the light flickered out. No warning, no sign, just suddenly gone. I froze. I didn't move. I stood there, staring into the darkness where the light had been, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, but the sense of dread in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. There was something wrong. Something wasn't right. I forced myself to take another step, then another, until I reached the spot where the light had been. It was gone and nothing else was around. No cabin, no sign of a person, nothing. I stood there, staring into the emptiness, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but the fear was starting to feel overwhelming. My head was spinning, and the loneliness, the isolation, hit me harder than I expected. I had to make a choice. I could continue wandering, deeper into this dark forest, or I could turn back, even if it meant retracing my steps without any clear direction. I decided to turn back. The hike back was long, and it felt like I was going in circles, but eventually, I heard the faint sound of running water in the distance. A stream, maybe. I headed toward it, hopeful, and as I got closer, I saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. My heart surged with relief. I pushed through the last stretch of the woods until I finally emerged from the trees and saw the parking lot up ahead, just as I had left it, my car waiting for me. The sense of safety flooded through me, and I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so grateful for something so simple. The forest had taken hours from me, and I wasn't sure how long I had actually been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never take a hike like that again. There were things in those woods that I would never understand, and I didn't want to. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and drove off, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I wasn't looking back. It started as a routine hike, the kind I had done countless times before. I've always enjoyed getting out into nature. Fresh air, trees, the quiet hum of distant wildlife. My friends often teased me about my love for being alone in the woods, but there was something calming about it. The familiarity of the trail I was on made it easy to lose track of time. I set out early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The air was cool, but there was promise of warmth later in the day. I wore a sturdy pair of boots, packed some water, a few snacks, and a map I had printed out the night before. It wasn't my first time on this particular trail, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I've always been careful to stick to the marked paths. I didn't trust myself to go off the trail too much. Who knows what kind of terrain is out there, especially when the weather changes. But this time, something felt different. As I walked, I kept checking the time and the map, reassured by the progress I thought I was making. Hours passed, and I made my way deeper into the forest. The tall trees around me began to feel less familiar, their trunks more twisted, the underbrush thicker. The trail, once wide and well-maintained, began to narrow. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in the ground's texture and the way the trees crowded closer together. Still, nothing that made me feel uneasy. That was until I noticed the quiet. It's odd how you don't realize how loud nature is until it suddenly goes silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds, no animals scampering through the underbrush. Just stillness. I paused, scanning my surroundings. The hairs on my neck stood up, but I tried to shake off the unease. It wasn't like anything was wrong, but I couldn't deny that something didn't feel right. I kept walking, faster now, almost like I was trying to outrun the unease. The trail had become barely visible in places. My boots crunching on the gravel sounded louder with each step. The trees loomed around me, casting long shadows. A sense of being watched crept up on me, the way you might feel if you're walking alone in a dark alley. It was the kind of feeling that starts as a small doubt in your mind, then slowly grows into something harder to ignore. Then, I realized I hadn't seen any other hikers for hours. I stopped again, looking around. The trees were dense, the path ahead seeming to disappear into the wilderness. My heart began to pound in my chest. The map, which I had checked periodically, seemed to be less and less helpful. The landmarks I remembered from the trail weren't matching up with what I saw now. I turned the map this way and that, my mind racing. I was lost. I had to be. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. Panicking wouldn't help. My phone was in my pocket, but no signal. Of course, it was always like that in the woods, and I had known that going in. I tried to remember which way I'd come, but the trees all looked the same now. I couldn't even recall the last landmark I passed. I took a few more steps forward, hoping to see something familiar, but there was nothing, just the endless trees and the growing silence. The day seemed to slip away faster than I realized. I hadn't noticed how late it was getting. The sun, once high in the sky, was now beginning to dip behind the trees. The woods, already darkened by the thick canopy above, seemed even darker with each passing minute. That was when I heard it, the snap of a twig. It was faint, but it made my heart skip a beat. I froze. The sound had come from behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. No movement. Nothing but the thick trees standing silently in the dimming light. I couldn't stay in one place. I needed to keep moving. If I stopped, I'd get colder, and nightfall was coming fast. I walked for what felt like hours, constantly checking my watch, hoping for any sign that I was heading in the right direction. My legs were starting to ache, and my water was running low. I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife or even any birds since that eerie silence had settled in. The only sound was my own footsteps, the rustling of the leaves beneath my boots. I thought about trying to find a place to make camp for the night, but I didn't have enough supplies. The sun was almost gone now, and the shadows in the forest were growing long and ominous. I needed to find my way out before it got dark. But the deeper I went, the more it seemed like the woods were closing in on me. The trail had completely vanished. I was no longer following anything but my own gut instincts, which were telling me I was going in circles. I stopped again, breath quick and shallow. It was at that moment I realized I wasn't just lost. Something was wrong. The trees around me didn't look like the same ones I had passed hours ago. The underbrush was thicker. The air felt heavier. I was running on nothing but instinct now. I turned left, then right, every direction seeming to blend into the next. Panic began to rise in my chest, but I forced myself to keep calm. I couldn't let myself get caught up in fear. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I heard the sound again. That snap of a twig. Closer this time. I spun around. Nothing. Was I imagining things? Was I really hearing things now? I didn't know. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. But there was something deeper in that silence that felt wrong. a presence I couldn't see but could feel, just out of sight, moving through the trees. I wasn't alone. I started walking faster, my heart thudding in my chest. The branches scraped against my face, the trail getting more difficult to navigate. My mind raced, thinking back to all the survival tips I had read about. Stay calm, don't panic, keep your bearings, but none of it helped. I stumbled. The ground was uneven, and I tripped over a root that had risen from the soil. I caught myself before falling, but it took a moment to steady myself. When I looked up, I saw it. A break in the trees, a small clearing. And in that clearing, there was a building. A cabin, old and weathered, standing alone in the middle of the woods. I didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. On one hand, it was shelter, and that was what I needed. On the other hand, who built a cabin out here? There were no other hikers on this trail. No signs of human life for miles. But what choice did I have? The night was closing in, and the temperature was dropping. I approached the cabin cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open. The interior was dark and smelled of must, but it was dry. It was empty, no signs of anyone having lived there for years. There were dusty old chairs, a stone fireplace, and a small table. A faint light filtered through the cracks in the wood. I dropped my backpack onto the floor and sat on one of the chairs. It was quiet here, too quiet, but it was shelter. I was safe for now. The door creaked again, and I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. But when I turned around, I saw nothing. I wasn't sure whether I imagined it, but it felt like something had been watching me. I spent the night there, staring at the dark woods outside the cabin's small window, wondering if I would make it out in the morning. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had heard in the woods. Was it just animals, or was something else out there? Couldn't be sure. But when the sun finally rose the next day, I stepped out of the cabin to find the forest not as ominous as the night before. I retraced my steps, looking for anything familiar. Slowly but surely, I found my way back to the trail. It took most of the morning, but I eventually made it back to the main path and was able to follow it out of the woods. I learned that day not to underestimate the woods. It's easy to think you know them, to feel safe and familiar. But the woods have a way of making you question everything, your senses, your memory, your safety. I don't know how I ended up in that cabin, or if I was just lucky to find it, but I made it out, and I'll never take the woods for granted again. I slowly took another step, the damp leaves underfoot crunching softly as the faint rustling of branches whispered above me. The forest around me seemed endless, an intimidating labyrinth of thick trees, tangled roots, and shadows that clung to everything. I had been walking for hours, or at least it felt that way. The sun had long since disappeared behind a thick curtain of clouds, and now the light was slowly fading, the once vibrant greens of the trees turning into muted browns and grays. I could feel the weight of the coming night, a suffocating, heavy presence that pressed down on my chest. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had come into the woods just to take a short walk, to clear my head. It was supposed to be a peaceful hike, just a few hours to escape the noise of everyday life. But now, every path I turned down led to another, and soon, I couldn't remember which way I'd come from. The trees, so familiar when I first arrived, now seemed to mock me with their towering presence. Everything looked the same. The more I walked, the more lost I became. I checked my phone again. The screen flickered dimly, showing just one bar of service. I cursed under my breath. No signal. The GPS map I tried to use earlier had been useless. The dense canopy above blocked any satellite signals, and I was left with nothing but the thickening dark around me and the rising panic in my chest. I had been so sure that I'd only needed a few more steps to reach the main trail, but I had been wrong. With every step I took, I became more aware of how little I knew about this place. This wasn't like the local park trails I had hiked before. These woods were deeper, wilder, untouched by the well-worn paths I was accustomed to. The trees here didn't follow the neat lines of a planned trail. They sprawled, twisted, and spread like wild fingers reaching into the sky. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The last thing I needed was to lose control, to panic and make rash decisions. But with each passing minute, the growing uncertainty in my chest became harder to ignore. My legs were starting to ache, and the back of my throat was dry. I hadn't brought enough water. I hadn't prepared for this. I hadn't prepared for getting lost. I scanned my surroundings again, hoping for any sign of a path or some recognizable landmark. But there was nothing, just trees, just the endless expanse of the forest. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, the moisture of the soil seeping into my boots as I trudged forward. The ground was uneven, and my feet stumbled more often than I would have liked. Then I heard it dot a sound, a rustle not from the trees above, but from the ground. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was a soft sound, but distinct. A movement, something shifting through the underbrush. My mind raced, thinking of all the animals that might be out here. Deer, foxes, maybe a raccoon or squirrel. But there was something different about the sound. It was too deliberate, too close that I took another step backward, my eyes darting around the trees. The sound stopped. Was I hearing things? I stood still, waiting for any sign of movement. The only thing I could hear now was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. The rest of the forest was eerily silent, like it was holding its breath. I didn't know how long I stood there, straining to listen. Minutes? Hours? But there was nothing. Reluctantly, I turned and continued walking, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that was starting to crawl up my spine. I told myself that I was just overreacting, that it was just a bird or a small animal. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond my sight, was too strong to shake. I quickened my pace, the sounds of my footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The further I walked, the darker it got. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. The trees had closed in on me, their branches reaching down, as though trying to trap me in this maze of trunks and leaves. The air was colder now, a chill creeping into my bones. I shivered despite the warmth of my jacket. I checked my phone again, desperate for any sign of life, any signal. But still nothing. It felt like the entire world had shut me out. And then, as I trudged forward, I saw something, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there, only trees and shadows. My breath quickened as I scanned the area around me, but still no sign of anything. I forced myself to keep walking, to push through the fear and focus on getting out. Minutes passed, but my sense of direction was failing me. The woods were becoming more oppressive, more confusing. I couldn't tell if I was walking in circles or heading deeper into the wilderness. The trees seemed to loom larger now, their trunks darker, more twisted. I could feel the anxiety tightening around my chest like a vice that I had to stop. I had to think that I found a patch of relatively flat ground beneath a cluster of trees and sank down onto the cool earth. I rested my head in my hands, trying to focus on my breathing. Think, focus. How had I gotten here? How had I lost my way? It wasn't like me. I was usually so careful, but now I felt completely helpless. A single speck of dust in a vast, wild world. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, trying to push away the rising panic. I couldn't let it consume me. Not yet. I still had time. I still had a chance. I stood up again, my legs stiff and sore, but I couldn't just sit there. The dark was closing in fast. I had to keep moving. I took one more step forward, and then another. My mind was racing with thoughts of how to get back. What was the best route? Should I follow the direction of the wind? the moss on the trees, my gut, but none of those seemed reliable now. It all felt like a guessing game. Suddenly, I stopped. There was something different in the air. I could smell something odd. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger with every breath I took. A sharp, acrid scent, like something had been burned. I glanced around, my heart pounding, but there was no fire, no smoke, just the thick, damp air of the forest. And then I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, a flicker of light, a faint, almost imperceptible glow. I wasn't sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I felt a surge of hope, like that was all I needed to see. Could be another hiker or a cabin or some kind of campfire. Anything that would pull me out of this nightmare. I began to walk toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last. My legs were trembling now, my body exhausted from hours of aimless wandering. But I didn't care. I had to reach that light. With each step, the light grew brighter, and the smell became sharper. It was definitely closer now. I could almost taste the bitterness in the air, but it didn't matter. The light was real. It had to be. And then suddenly I was there. The light was coming from an old, rusted lantern, hanging from a tree. There was no campfire, no people, just the lantern swinging gently in the wind. Its faint glow illuminated the surrounding area, casting long, eerie shadows on the trees. The air around it still smelled like something had been burned, but there was no sign of fire. It didn't make sense. I reached out, almost afraid to touch the lantern, as if it might vanish if I did. But it didn't. It was solid, real, and I could feel its warmth on my hand as I held it. And then, in the quiet, I heard it. A voice, far off in the distance, faint but unmistakable. "Are you lost?" It was a calm, steady voice. Not a person, not anything I had heard before, but it was a voice. I turned in the direction of the sound, the cold night wrapping itself around me, and for the first time in hours, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. There was someone out there, and I wasn't lost anymore. It started as a simple hike, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times before. I'd picked a trail I hadn't tried yet, a quiet path that promised a scenic view at the top of a ridge. The weather was perfect, cool but sunny, with a gentle breeze that carried the earthy scent of pine and moss. My pack was light, just the essentials: water, a snack, a basic first aid kit, and my phone for taking pictures. I wasn't worried. The trail was marked, albeit faintly. Wooden posts with faded red paint appeared at intervals, pointing the way. I'd read online that this trail wasn't heavily trafficked, which suited me fine. I enjoyed solitude. There was something about being alone in the woods that cleared my head, like the trees absorbed all the noise of life. About an hour in, the trail began to narrow. The trees pressed closer, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patches on the forest floor. I noticed the markers becoming scarcer. First, I shrugged it off. The path was still visible, even if it was overgrown in spots. I reasoned that I could always backtrack if necessary. It wasn't until I reached a fork in the trail that I hesitated. The path split into two, and there was no marker to indicate which direction was correct. I glanced back the way I came, the trees already obscuring the view of the trail behind me. I checked my phone for GPS, but the signal was weak, and the map app refused to load. Frustration bubbled up, but I pushed it down. To figure it out, I chose the right-hand path, deciding it looked more worn than the other. The trail climbed steeply, the air growing cooler as I ascended. After about 15 minutes, I realized something was off. The trail was becoming harder to distinguish from the rest of the forest floor. Fallen leaves and pine needles had blanketed it, and branches reached out like fingers to snag my clothes. The faint buzz of unease began to grow louder in my mind. I decided to turn back, but as I retraced my steps, nothing looked familiar. Every tree, every rock seemed to blend into the next, an endless repetition of green and brown. I'd taken wrong turns before on hikes, but this was different. The forest felt vast, like it was swallowing me whole. I tried to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I pulled out my phone again, holding it up in search of a signal. Nothing, just the little spinning wheel where bars should be. I cursed under my breath and stuffed it back into my pocket. I still had plenty of daylight, I told myself. I find my way back. The hours passed in a haze of walking and second-guessing. I tried following the sun, reasoning that it would guide me westward, where I'd parked my car. But the trees made it impossible to track the sun's arc accurately, and the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The forest floor was a maze of animal trails and dry creek beds, all of which seemed to lead nowhere. My water bottle was half empty by the time I admitted I was lost. Truly, hopelessly lost. I'd been trying to convince myself otherwise, but the truth was unavoidable now. The shadows were lengthening, the sun slipping lower in the sky. I needed to find shelter before nightfall. The thought of spending the night in the woods sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly in the dark. I searched for a spot to hunker down. A fallen tree with a hollowed-out trunk caught my eye. It wasn't much, but it would provide some cover from the elements. I gathered branches and leaves to create a makeshift bed, trying to ignore the creeping sensation of vulnerability. The forest was alive with sounds. Rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the occasional crack of a branch. Every noise set my nerves on edge. As the last light faded, I forced myself to eat the granola bar I'd packed. My stomach was in knots, but I knew I needed the energy. The night was colder than I'd anticipated, and I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering. Sleep was out of the question. I sat in the darkness, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary, every minute stretching into an eternity. When dawn finally broke, it brought a sliver of relief. The forest seemed less menacing in the daylight. I set out again, determined to find my way. My legs were sore, and my throat was dry, but I pushed on. I thought about following a stream, reasoning that it might lead to a larger body of water or even a road. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon a creek. The water was clear, trickling over smooth stones. I drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing my parched throat. I refilled my bottle, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since I'd gotten lost. I decided to follow the creek downstream, figuring it was my best chance of finding civilization. The creek wound through the forest, twisting and turning, sometimes disappearing into the undergrowth only to reappear a few yards later. The terrain was uneven, and I slipped more than once on the moss-covered rocks. My feet ached, my boots rubbing blisters into my heels, but I kept going. Around midday, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks, the faint rumble of an engine. My heart leapt. I scrambled up the bank, moving as quickly as my tired legs would allow. The sound grew louder, and soon I emerged onto a gravel road. Relief washed over me, so overwhelming that I nearly collapsed. I flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a dusty pickup truck driven by an older man. He looked startled when he saw me, probably because I was filthy and disheveled, but he stopped. I explained my situation in a rush, my words tumbling over each other. He nodded and motioned for me to get in. The man drove me to a ranger station a few miles away. They gave me water, checked me over for injuries, and asked a dozen questions about how I'd gotten lost. I answered as best as I could, though my memory of the past day felt hazy, like a bad dream. Sitting in that ranger station, safe and warm, I felt a wave of gratitude. I'd made it out. I'd gotten lost in the woods, truly lost, but I'd found my way back. The experience had shaken me, but it had also taught me something important. Never underestimate nature. It's vast and indifferent, beautiful but unforgiving. I've been lucky, and I knew I'd never take that luck for granted again. I'll never forget the way the air felt that evening. Crisp, sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine. I had always enjoyed hiking. There was something calming about being surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was my escape from the world. But on that day, the woods felt different. They were quieter, darker, and I had made a mistake. It started with confidence. I'd been on this trail before, but instead of following the marked path like I usually did, I decided to explore a bit deeper. The weather was clear, the sun still high enough that I wasn't worried about daylight running out. I had my phone, a bottle of water, and a granola bar stuffed in my backpack. I wasn't planning on being out long. The trees grew denser as I stepped off the trail, my boots crunching against the underbrush. First, it was exhilarating. The solitude was complete, the forest alive with faint rustles and the occasional scurry of an unseen creature. I didn't realize how much I had wandered until I turned to retrace my steps and noticed nothing. No path, no trail, not even a clear idea of which direction I'd come from. I told myself not to panic. People get lost in the woods all the time and make it out just fine. I took a deep breath, trying to focus. The trick, I remembered, was to stay calm and orient yourself. I scanned the trees, looking for landmarks or anything that seemed familiar. But everything looked the same: towering trunks, tangled branches, patches of moss. Even the sunlight, once a guide, was now slipping away, the shadows growing long and twisting in ways that made everything look unfamiliar. I pulled out my phone to check for service. No bars. The map app wouldn't load. I cursed under my breath, shoving it back into my pocket. My pulse quickened as I tried to decide what to do. If I kept moving, I'd have to pick a direction and hope it led me somewhere recognizable. But if I stayed put, the forest would get darker and the cold would creep in. I decided to walk. Staying still felt too much like giving up. I picked what seemed like a straight path and moved quickly, trying to leave markers as I went. I broke small branches, made piles of rocks, anything to mark my trail. But as the hours passed, I began to realize I was just wandering in circles. The landmarks I left were gone, or maybe I had never left them properly in the first place. The forest seemed to close in on me. The once inviting rustling now felt like whispers, the snap of a branch making me jump every time. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world was swallowed by shadows. I reached into my bag and pulled out the flashlight I always carried. The beam sliced through the dark, but it only illuminated the small patch of forest directly in front of me. Everything beyond that was pitch black. My legs were aching, and my throat was dry. I rationed the water carefully, taking small sips to make it last. My granola bar was gone in a few bites, and the hunger gnawed at my stomach. I tried to distract myself by focusing on small goals. Keep moving, find a clearing, look for signs of life. But every time I thought I'd made progress, I'd find myself staring at the same trees, the same rocks, the same damn moss. I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was walking in circles. Maybe I should have stayed put. Maybe I should have paid more attention to the trail. The thoughts swirled in my head, feeding the growing panic. My breath came faster, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight beam shook in my hand, and I had to force myself to stop, to close my eyes and breathe. Focus, I whispered to myself. You can do this. I decided to try something different. I remembered reading about how streams often lead to civilization. Water flows downhill and people tend to build near it. So I listened carefully, trying to catch the faint sound of running water. At first, there was nothing but the hum of the forest. But then, faintly, I heard it. A trickle, a soft gurgle of water. My heart leapt, and I turned toward the sound, moving as quickly as I could. The stream was small, barely more than a creek, but it was something. I followed it, the flashlight beam bouncing ahead of me. The terrain was rough, the ground uneven and slick with mud. I slipped more than once, my hands and knees scraped from catching myself. But I kept going, driven by the hope that this stream would lead me somewhere. Anywhere. Hours passed. The stream widened, then narrowed, twisting and turning through the forest. I tried to stay optimistic, but fatigue was setting in. My legs felt like lead, and my eyes struggled to stay open. The cold had seeped into my bones, and I knew I couldn't keep going much longer. Then, just as I was about to collapse, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. First, I thought it was my imagination, but as I got closer, the light grew stronger. It wasn't natural, it was warm and steady, the kind of light that comes from a bulb, not the moon. I stumbled toward it, my heart racing with a mix of hope and fear. The light came from a cabin. It was small and weathered, tucked between the trees like it had been there forever. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the faint hum of a generator reached my ears. I hesitated for only a moment before knocking on the door, the sound echoing in the still night. No one answered, but the door creaked open under the pressure of my hand. Inside, the cabin was empty but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. A table sat in the center of the room, a half-empty mug of coffee and an open book resting on it. Whoever lived here wasn't home, but they couldn't have been gone for long. I collapsed into a chair by the fire, letting the warmth seep into me. My exhaustion was complete, and I barely had the energy to feel guilty for intruding. I knew I should wait for the owner to return, to explain myself and ask for help. But as I sat there, the reality of what I'd been through hit me. I'd made it. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I'd found safety, even if it was temporary. When the cabin's owner finally returned, they were understandably startled to find a stranger in their home. But after I explained my situation, they softened. They offered me food, water, and a place to sleep. The next morning, they guided me back to the main trail, ensuring I wouldn't lose my way again. As I stepped back onto the familiar path, the sunlight filtering through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. The forest had been unforgiving, but I'd survived. And as I walked towards civilization, the cabin and its kind owner fading into the distance, I promised myself I'd never underestimate nature again. I woke up to the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and the smell of damp earth. The sun, though faint, seeped through the canopy above, casting long, jagged shadows on the forest floor. My heart was pounding, not from exertion but from sheer confusion. How did I end up here? The last thing I remembered was hiking on a well-marked trail, a quick afternoon trip to clear my mind. My backpack held a bottle of water, a granola bar, and my phone. But now, as I turned in a slow circle, I realized the trail was gone. Trees surrounded me in every direction, identical and unyielding. My phone was dead, a cold black screen offering no solace. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Panic wouldn't help. I'd read enough survival guides to know that. Stay calm, conserve energy, and assess the situation. Easier said than done when every instinct screamed to run. I checked my watch. It was late afternoon, around 4 p.m. That gave me a few hours of daylight at best. I needed to act quickly. First, I tried retracing my steps, walking in what I thought was the direction I'd come from. But every step seemed to lead me deeper into the labyrinth of trees. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and fallen branches that snagged at my boots. After what felt like an eternity, I paused to take stock. My mouth was dry, so I sipped from my water bottle, rationing it carefully. The granola bar stayed in my pack. I might need it more later. The thought of spending the night out here was a cold weight in my chest, but I pushed it aside. One problem at a time. I scanned the horizon for any sign of a landmark. A hill, a break in the trees, anything. There was nothing but an endless sea of green and brown. Then I remembered, follow water. Streams often lead to rivers, which lead to civilization. I listened carefully, holding my breath. At first, there was only silence. Then, faintly, the sound of trickling water reached my ears. Hope surged through me as I moved toward the sound. The terrain grew steeper, and the ground became slick with moss and mud. I slipped once, landing hard on my side, but the sight of the stream a few minutes later was worth it. The water was clear, rushing over smooth stones, and I drank greedily, refilling my bottle. With the stream as my guide, I began to follow it downhill. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped lower, and the temperature dropped. I kept moving, even as fatigue clawed at my legs. Stopping now felt like giving up. As dusk settled, I realized I needed shelter. The stream would be useful in the morning, but staying too close to it overnight wasn't safe. Wild animals also relied on water, and I didn't want an uninvited encounter. I found a cluster of large rocks a short distance from the stream and used fallen branches and leaves to create a crude lean-to. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the wind. The night was the longest I'd ever endured. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. The darkness was oppressive, absolute. I clutched my backpack to my chest, as if it could shield me from whatever lurked beyond my shelter. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the cries of distant animals and the relentless cold. When dawn finally broke, it felt like a small miracle. The pale light revealed a world that was both familiar and alien. The stream was still there, its steady flow a comforting constant. I stretched my stiff limbs and ate half of the granola bar, savoring every bite. Energy renewed, I resumed my journey. The hours blurred together. I followed the stream as it wound through the forest, crossing it several times when the terrain forced me to. The soles of my boots were soaked, and blisters formed on my heels. But the thought of finding a way out kept me moving. By midday, the stream widened into a small river. The sound of the water grew louder, almost deafening, as I approached a series of rapids. Beyond them, the river bent sharply, disappearing into the trees. I hesitated. Crossing the rapids looked dangerous, but staying put wasn't an option. I chose a narrow point where the water was shallowest and stepped carefully from stone to stone. The current was stronger than I'd anticipated, pulling at my legs with every step. Halfway across, I slipped. The icy water enveloped me, stealing my breath. I flailed, grabbing at the slippery rocks, and managed to haul myself onto the far bank. Shivering and soaked, I collapsed on the ground, letting the sun warm me as I caught my breath. The day wore on. I noticed subtle changes in the forest. The trees grew thinner, and patches of sunlight dappled the ground more frequently. It felt like progress, though I had no way to be sure. My thoughts turned to the people who might be looking for me. Had anyone noticed I was missing? Would they even know where to search? The uncertainty gnawed at me. As the sun dipped lower once more, I stumbled upon an overgrown path. It was faint, barely more than a line of trampled grass and disturbed earth, but it was unmistakably man-made. My heart leapt. I followed it eagerly, my exhaustion forgotten. The path twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing entirely, but I pressed on. As night fell, I saw a flicker of light through the trees. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A surge of adrenaline propelled me forward, ignoring the branches that clawed at my face and the roots that threatened to trip me. The light grew brighter, resolving into the glow of a campfire. Relief flooded me as I stumbled into a small clearing. A group of campers looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. Their faces blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I managed to croak out a greeting. They gave me water and food, their voices a mix of concern and curiosity. Someone handed me a blanket, and I wrapped it around my shoulders, finally letting myself feel the weight of the ordeal. As I explained what had happened, one of them radioed for help. It turned out I wasn't far from a ranger station. The rangers arrived an hour later, guiding me back to safety. The warmth of their truck, the hum of the engine, felt like the most luxurious comfort I'd ever known. I looked out the window as the forest receded into the distance, a dark, sprawling mystery that had both terrified and humbled me. By the time we reached the station, the stars were out, bright and indifferent against the velvet sky. I'd made it. I was safe. And though I'd never venture into the woods alone again, I couldn't help but feel a quiet respect for the wilderness that had tested me in ways I'd never imagined. The air was damp, and the fading light of day filtered weakly through the dense canopy of trees overhead. I hadn't planned for this, but somehow here I was, deep in the woods, disoriented and struggling to find my way out. My feet ached, my back was sore, and every step forward felt like a gamble. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a short walk to clear my head, but now the forest felt like it had swallowed me whole. It started in the early afternoon. The sun was high, the weather warm but not oppressive, and I felt restless. I had picked a trail I'd never tried before, one that seemed promising on the map. It was marked as moderately difficult, with a loop that returned to the starting point. Perfect for a few hours of fresh air and solitude, I thought. I packed a small backpack with a water bottle, a granola bar, and my phone. My confidence was unwarranted. I hadn't even considered the possibility of getting lost. The first hour was uneventful. The trail was well-trodden, with clear markers on the trees and signs pointing in the right direction. Birds chirped in the branches above, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. I felt a deep sense of peace. This was exactly what I'd needed, I told myself. To be alone with my thoughts, far away from the noise and distractions of everyday life. But then I came to a fork in the trail. The signpost was weathered and faded, the arrows barely legible. I squinted, trying to make out the markings, and after a moment's hesitation, I chose the left path. It seemed like the right choice at the time. The trail was wide and well-maintained. I convinced myself it would loop back around eventually. Didn't. The further I walked, the narrower the trail became. The trees closed in, their gnarled branches forming a tangled maze above me. The air grew cooler, and the sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. I started to feel uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe I had misunderstood the map. Maybe the trail would open up again around the next bend. But it didn't. Minutes turned into hours, and the trail seemed to dissolve into nothing. The markers disappeared, replaced by undergrowth and fallen branches. I checked my phone, hoping to use GPS to find my way back, but there was no signal. Panic started to creep in. I told myself to stay calm. People get lost in the woods all the time, don't they? The important thing is not to panic. I tried to retrace my steps, turning back the way I had come, but everything looked the same. The trees were indistinguishable from one another, their bark a patchwork of moss and lichen. I couldn't find the trail I had been following. It was as if the forest had erased it. The sun was sinking lower now, its golden light giving way to shadows. I'd read somewhere that it's important to keep moving in situations like this, to find higher ground or follow a stream. But there were no streams, and every direction felt like a dead end. I picked a direction at random and started walking. My pace quickened as the light faded. The sounds of the forest grew louder in the twilight. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the snapping of twigs underfoot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew it was just my imagination. Still, every sound made me jump. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest was pitch black, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I used the flashlight on my phone sparingly, worried about draining the battery. The beam of light was small and weak, barely cutting through the darkness. My steps were slow and cautious now, each one a gamble in the uneven terrain. I stumbled on a root and fell hard onto my hands and knees. Pain shot through me as I scraped my palms on the rough ground. I sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to collect myself. This wasn't how I'd imagined the day going. I felt stupid for not being more prepared, for underestimating the wilderness. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. My water bottle was nearly empty, and my stomach growled. I chewed on the granola bar, but it did little to satisfy my hunger. The forest was alive with sounds. Insects buzzing, animals scurrying through the underbrush, the distant call of a coyote. Each noise felt amplified in the silence of the night. I found a small clearing and decided to stop for a while. My legs were exhausted, and my body ached from the effort of navigating the uneven ground. I sat with my back against a tree, my flashlight pointed downward to conserve the battery. The world felt impossibly vast and uncaring. I thought about home, about how warm and safe it was compared to this. Would anyone realize I was missing? Would they come looking for me? The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something. A crack, a rustle, a distant cry, and my heart would race. I stayed awake, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, my ears straining to catch every sound. The hours dragged on, each one longer than the last. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees. The forest looked different in the morning light, less menacing but no less confusing. I stood up, stretching my stiff limbs, and tried to orient myself. My phone was nearly dead, but I used it to check the compass. I decided to head east, hoping it would lead me to a road or a clearing or some sign of civilization. The day was a blur of walking and searching. I found a small stream and drank deeply, the cold water reviving me. I followed it for a while, thinking it might lead to something, but it seemed to wind aimlessly through the forest. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive. My clothes were damp with sweat, and my skin itched from insect bites. Still, I kept moving. By late afternoon, I was desperate. My legs felt like lead, and my throat was parched. I came across a ridge and climbed to the top, hoping to get a better view. From there, I could see the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. My heart sank. There were no roads, no houses, no signs of life, just trees as far as the eye could see. I sat down on the ridge, trying to think. My mind felt foggy from exhaustion and hunger. I knew I couldn't stay here, but I didn't know where to go. The forest felt like a labyrinth, its paths leading nowhere. I felt small and helpless, lost in a world that didn't care whether I lived or died. But then I spotted something in the distance, a faint wisp of smoke rising above the trees. My heart leapt. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. I scrambled down the ridge, ignoring the pain in my legs, and headed in the direction of the smoke. It was difficult to keep my bearings in the dense forest, but I used the sun as a guide, keeping it on my left as I walked. As I got closer, the smoke grew thicker, more distinct. I pushed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and finally stumbled into another clearing. There, in the center, was a small campsite. A man stood by a fire, his back to me, tending to a pot of something steaming. He turned at the sound of my approach, his face a mix of surprise and concern. I collapsed to my knees, relief washing over me like a wave. The man rushed to help, offering me water and a seat by the fire. He listened as I told him my story, his expression serious but kind. He was a hunter, he explained, out here for a few days. He had a map and a radio, and he assured me we could contact someone to come get me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt safe. The forest hadn't beaten me after all. It had tested me, pushed me to my limits, but in the end, I'd found my way back to humanity. As I sat by the fire, the warmth seeping into my bones, I realized how fragile and precious life truly is. The woods had humbled me, taught me respect for their vastness and power. I would never take them lightly again. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction. They seemed alive, breathing with the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the distant call of unseen creatures. I didn't plan to be here, not like this anyway. It started as a simple hike, a way to clear my head. But now, standing under a canopy of trees so dense that sunlight barely seeped through, I realized I had underestimated this place. The trail had seemed straightforward enough at first. A winding dirt path, well worn by countless boots before mine, meandered through the forest. The map in my back pocket felt more like a formality than a necessity. I thought I'd be out and back before dusk. But at some point, I couldn't even say exactly when, I'd made a wrong turn. The trail had narrowed, the dirt giving way to uneven patches of roots and moss. And then, abruptly, it disappeared altogether. First, I told myself it was fine.
backtrack.
Retraced my steps until I found the trail again. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the knot in my stomach tightened. Every tree looked the same. Every direction seemed to lead nowhere. The sinking realization hit me. I was lost. I checked my phone, hoping for salvation in the form of GPS. No signal. The screen might as well have been a brick in my hand. I stuffed it back into my pocket, my fingers trembling slightly. My water bottle was half full, and I had a single granola bar in my bag. Not exactly a survival kit. I decided to keep moving. Standing still felt like admitting defeat. Maybe if I walked far enough, I'd stumble across a landmark, a road, or, God willing, another human being. The forest, though, had other plans. The terrain grew more challenging, the ground uneven and riddled with roots that seemed to reach out to trip me. My boots scraped against rocks hidden beneath the undergrowth, and twice I nearly twisted my ankle. The hours blurred together. The light filtering through the trees grew dimmer, shifting from gold to a muted gray. I couldn't tell if it was late afternoon or if storm clouds were gathering overhead. Either way, the thought of being stuck here after dark sent a spike of panic through me. I pushed forward, my breaths coming shallow and quick. And then it started to rain. It wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was a sudden, drenching downpour that soaked me to the bone within minutes. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. My clothes clung to me, heavy and uncomfortable. The forest floor turned to mud, slippery and treacherous. My boots squelched with every step. I needed shelter. The thought came as an instinct, primal and urgent. I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the trees. Finally, I spotted a cluster of rocks that jutted out of the ground like jagged teeth. Beneath them was a small overhang, just big enough to crouch under. I hurried toward it, slipping and sliding in the mud, and collapsed beneath the rocky outcrop. The rain continued to pour, a relentless curtain of water. I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to conserve body heat. My breath fogged in the chilly air. I felt small, insignificant against the vastness of the forest and the storm. It was humbling in a way I hadn't expected or wanted. As the rain eased, my resolve hardened. I couldn't stay here. The idea of spending the night in this damp, cold spot was unbearable. I stood, my muscles protesting, and resumed my search for a way out. The woods seemed different now. The rain had transformed them, washing away any trace of a trail. The ground was slick and unsteady, the air thick with the earthy scent of wet soil and decaying leaves. Every sound felt amplified: the drip of water from the trees, the rustle of animals moving unseen, the occasional crack of a branch. My senses were on high alert, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I kept moving, my pace slowing as fatigue set in. My legs ached, and my stomach growled with hunger. I rationed the granola bar, taking small bites and chewing slowly, trying to make it last. The water in my bottle was almost gone. The realization that I might not find more was a constant weight on my mind. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor. I knew I had to find a place to stop for the night. Wandering aimlessly in the dark was a recipe for disaster. My eyes scanned the area, searching for anything that could serve as a makeshift shelter. Eventually, I found a large tree with a hollowed-out base. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the elements. I cleared away the debris inside, creating a small space to sit. The air was damp and smelled of mildew, but it was better than nothing. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stay warm as the temperature dropped further. The night was long. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of what I prayed was just a coyote. Sleep was impossible. My mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying the events that had led me here and imagining what might come next. I felt the weight of my own vulnerability, my own fragility in the face of nature's indifference. When dawn finally broke, it felt like a small victory. The pale light revealed a forest that looked both familiar and alien. I forced myself to eat the last of the granola bar and sipped the remaining water sparingly. My body felt heavy, my movements sluggish, but I pushed myself to keep going. I tried to think logically. The sun rose in the east, which meant I could use it to orient myself. If I could find a stream, it might lead to a larger body of water or even a road. The problem was finding one. The forest was vast, and there was no guarantee I was heading in the right direction. Hours passed. My throat was dry, my limbs weak. The forest seemed endless, an unyielding maze of trees and undergrowth. Just when I felt the first flicker of despair, I heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of running water. I followed the sound, my heart pounding with hope. The trees thinned, and I saw it, a narrow stream cutting through the forest. The water was clear, sparkling in the sunlight. I dropped to my knees at the edge, cupping my hands and drinking deeply. The cold water was a shock to my system, but it was exactly what I needed. I decided to follow the stream. Water often leads to civilization, or so I'd read. The terrain was still challenging, but the promise of finding help kept me moving. The stream widened as I went, and the sound of the water grew louder. I imagined it leading to a river, and from there maybe to a town or a campsite. As the sun began to set again, I saw something that made my heart leap. A wooden bridge spanning the stream. It was old and weathered, but it was proof of human presence. I crossed it, my steps careful on the slick wood, and on the other side I found a dirt path. This one was wide and well-trodden, clearly maintained. I followed the path, my pace quickening despite my exhaustion. And then, as the last light of day faded, I saw it, the warm, golden glow of a cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sight filled me with a sense of relief so profound that I nearly collapsed. I reached the cabin and knocked weakly on the door. It opened, and though I couldn't form the words to explain what had happened, the person inside understood. They offered me water, food, and a blanket, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt safe. The woods had tested me, pushed me to my limits, but I had made it out. The lesson was clear. Nature doesn't care about you. It's neither kind nor cruel. It simply is. And you have to respect it if you want to survive.